Hello, everyone. I hope all of you are doing well. Can I just have a quick shout, because I want some energy up in this room. So as you know, this is the most important panel for today. And I just want to say good afternoon to everyone. It's just an absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to this historic moment. For the first time ever, Media, Arts, and Culture panel at the Oxford Africa Conference. So let's give it up. Okay. This year's theme is Changing Narratives, as you all know. And it challenges us not to only reflect on policy and governance, but to also on the power of culture as a tool for shaping perception and inspiring change. In that spirit, today's panel, Reclaiming the Lens, is about just that. Empowering African voices to take authorship of their stories and to lead the way in redefining how Africa is seen, felt, and understood, both within the continent and globally. For far too long, African creativity has been celebrated abroad, but undervalued at home. Yet, as we know, storytelling through art, film, music, fashion, journalism is more than just expression. It is power. It is economy. It is identity. Africa's creative sector already generates billions in revenue, yet we are only scratching the surface of its potential. Today, we'll explore just how we can move from recognition to investment, from participation to ownership, and from fragmented voices to collective narrative power. We'll look at how we can build the infrastructure and ecosystems to support creatives, ensure representation without dilution, and inspire the next generation to see culture not as a sideline, but as a driver for transformation. We are joined by brilliant minds from across the media, fashion, journalism, and art worlds who will help us navigate these questions and share insight into how we can reclaim the lens and use it to shape Africa's future. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Charlotte Effa, who is a brand and marketing expert with over 10 years experience in marketing partnerships and digital advertising across global industries, luxury retail, FMCG, automotive, and entertainment. Charlotte, welcome. Secondly, we will have Manuel Kranting, is a multiple award-winning international journalist and media relations specialist. He has up to a decade's experience in African storytelling, working across several titles on and off the continent, including a documentary producer and news anchor with Joy News in Accra, Ghana, and most recently as a freelance political journalist and producer with BBC London. Welcome, Manuel. Next, I would like to invite a dear friend of mine. Elikem Logan is an art historian and a multidisciplinary creative and cultural strategist, passionate about reshaping African narratives through visual storytelling. His work bridges art, identity, innovation to amplify authentic voices on global platforms. Elikem, welcome. And next, we have Hamid Ibrahim, is the CEO and creative director of Kugali Media, a visual entertainment company that focuses on storytelling. And last, and certainly not the least, we have a celebrity within our midst, a Ghanaian rapper, singer, songwriter, and record producer renowned for his innovative fusion of musical genres and multilingual lyricism, Manifest. Welcome. All right. So how are we all feeling today? This is the fun panel, so I want you all to feel loose. We're going to talk about some great stuff. I'm really, really passionate about media, arts, and culture. I'm passionate about storytelling. It's such a pivotal and important part of our culture, our world, how we even see our own selves. So I'm really, really excited to dive into this conversation. Does anyone have just any words to share, anything quick at all before we kind of dive in?
Yeah, I'll just quickly start because I have the mic. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for staying around, and thank you for that brilliant introduction. I'm really excited that for the first time at least, as I've come to learn, that the Oxford Africa conferences, including a media, art, and culture panel. This has never happened, and it's, for me, an indication of a gravitation towards a point where we begin to appreciate the impact, the functionality, and frankly, the utility of the media and arts, and generally, you know, the culture of Africa. And so, as just an introductory point, just having this panel, I think, is a very monumental point for us.
Hi, everyone. Well, first of all, I just want to say it's a privilege to be here today. I'm very happy to be sat next to a very male-dominated panel, might I just add. So for my ladies in the room, I'm going to bring as much female energy as I can, because what is going on here? But I think, for me, when I think about Africa and changing narratives, there's so much abundance, and I think that is where the storytelling really lies. When you look at social media, people are complaining about sustainability, fast fashion, ethical practices. Africa has an abundance of that. You can look at your local artisans, Nigerian brands, so many tailors who are working on ground to do so much impactful work, and I think this story is there. I just think it's about how do we tell that to the world, how do we make that a global impact, and so for me, this is something I'm extremely passionate about. I work with so many brands, so I'm excited to see what our panel of men, again, are gonna say.
Thank you very much. I have to begin by saying thank you for having me, Nana-Saa, and to everyone in the committee. I was a member of the African Society myself when I was here doing my MSc in African Studies, and so it's a real honor to participate as part of the panel in this instance, and very much so in my area of competence in arts and culture, which has never happened before, so commendations again for representing that. Culture plays this very important role as the sort of front of house in diplomatic relations between nations. You know, we just had the former Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana here. And anytime a multilateral or bilateral state visit happens, the very first point of contact is a cultural one. You know, you will have dancers or you will have the exchange of gifts, which give you a little bit of an insight into the culture of the country. And it is in this vein that we should discuss the importance of culture for Africa and Africans. I am an art historian. That is my area, that is my background. The reason I decided to be an art historian is I took a trip to Rome for a religious studies A-level. And I went to Rome, we visited several churches around the Vatican, and then the excavations underneath the Vatican. And then we walked into St. Peter's Basilica through the excavations underneath the Vatican Church. You come out into this grand central dome designed by Michelangelo, finished by later architects because it took 100 years to complete. Bernini designed this great pedestal under which there is a church where the catacombs begin. There is a real sense, a real tangible sense of the importance of culture in these moments. You are immersed within a tradition, and that is inculcated within the mind of the viewer. This real heady sense of overwhelmingly important culture, a national culture, a national artistic tradition. I believe that the creation of this, the establishment of it, and the galvanization within an African context is precisely what we are missing and what we need to do in order to instill a real sense of participation in culture by Africans around the continent. So that is my, you know, my life's work, although I have a lot more life to live. And hopefully that's what we'll get into over the course of this conversation.
Right, thank you. Oh, awesome. So my name is Hamid Ibrahim, as you're told. I'm from the media side of things, or storytelling side of things. And I'd like to go deeper, don't worry, briefer, than where he went into. In that we speak about Africa, but most people don't quite understand that a culture and a place isn't really the geographical borders we draw around it. It's the stories we tell about the place. If, let's say today, there's somebody sitting in the audience over here, and they came from a tribe which we do not know the stories of, the tribe disappeared. Even if they're alive, that tribe is gone. So if the stories of Africa disappear, Africa doesn't exist anymore. It's just an idea, it's just something that existed in the past. So if all the people disappear but the stories remain, the place remains. If the stories disappear and the people remain, the place is gone. So that's the importance of stories. And also we tend to hear a lot about different governments or different, even our parents, saying we're losing our culture. That's just because we don't have the stories that are telling people about their culture. So if we're only consuming a Western view of the culture or a Western culture, of course we're going to adapt that culture. That's how it works.
No, no words? Okay, so let's start light. What does it mean for Africa to reclaim authorship of its own story? So I know a lot of you surely have slightly different answers depending on the industry that you're in. But yeah, how does this even show up in your own work?
I think when it comes to authorship, it's about ownership and having a voice and being able to enhance that. Essentially, when you think about branding, it's all about the idea of placing value and really showcasing and amplifying what the value is of a brand or a product or a service. Africa and African countries need to be seen as something that is powerful, that has a lot of culture within it. Like I said earlier, brands want to be affiliated with culture. They talk about it all the time. Africa has so much of that. So for me, I always say that when it comes to branding and storytelling, brands need to always have an African strategy. How are they, it's in a growing economy, how are they talking to that? So for me, one, it's about ownership. It's also about having the resources to back up that ownership, because I think it's great for our youth to have voices and speak up, but at the same time, if they don't have the infrastructure or the resources to match that, then those voices are not going to be heard and amplified. Secondly, I also do think it's about having people in the right places and spaces. So essentially, I think you need to have people on the ground really talking about the African voice, the African storytelling. But I also think it's equally important to have people in the West also guiding that narrative. I say that because I've been in so many rooms where if I feel like I hadn't been in, a different narrative might have been told, because they didn't have an understanding, they didn't have a clear brief, a simple, something as tiny as it can be. So I think just having the right people in the right places is extremely key. And sometimes I even battle with, do I need to move back to Ghana or Nigeria? Yes, by the way, I'm Ghanaian and Nigerian. And so I think it's something that I always think about, because I think it's a bit of a battle in thinking about whether you want to be back home, be on ground, and really make the impact there. But at the same time, I've personally seen that there aren't enough people in the spaces, because the reality is a lot of the rhetoric that is put about Africa is coming from the West, right? So if you don't have people in the rooms guiding that, you're going to have that continuous storytelling. So I just think it's equally as important to make sure both at home and both globally that you have people across the world who are really telling the African story.
I'll touch on this just because it literally lays right inside what I do, and also I have first-hand experience of the importance of this. So I'm one of the co-creators of Iwaju. I don't know if you guys have watched Iwaju, the TV series. I can see a few fans over there. So with Iwaju, one of the biggest complaints we had with most people was, hey, this thing has come out, it's about Nigeria, but we can only watch it just for a few days on the Disney Channel because there's no Disney Plus in most of Africa. That was one of the biggest complaints. And I always say back, Disney is the one who paid for it. We made sure to tell the story as authentically as possible. But if we are not the one giving the money to make that, the person who gave us that money has an interest. They had goals for it, right? So we did the best we could. But if we're not the ones funding it, we cannot control it. That's just a simple thing of it. We cannot control our narratives if we don't fund our narratives. It's very simple.
To put it just slightly differently, I mean, in the past couple of days, we have heard, and at the risk of sounding repetitive, that until the lion learns to tell its tale, its story, the tale of hunting will always glorify the hunter. Now, the question we're asking is, how do we reclaim the lens? You don't own the lens. You're renting the lens, and I want you to take a second to think about it. Across the world, the top 20, if you like, media organizations, and I don't want to say global media organizations, I'll come to that point quite shortly, are all perhaps Western. And quite recently, you have Al Jazeera, RT, and so on and so forth. There isn't a legacy media platform in Africa that we can wholly call ours. For instance, we have a digital channel, African News, that runs 24/7. It is sponsored by the EU and it's a subsidiary of Euronews. You have DW Deutsche Welle Africa, sponsored by the German taxpayer. You have BBC Africa, sponsored by the British taxpayer. Where is Africa in the entire conversation? And we talk about, and I freelance for a number of publications, and you pitch a story, and this is not particularly about the BBC, because I think the journey at the BBC has improved significantly, and our presence on the continent has been, I think we have the largest presence on the continent in terms of international media coverage. But you pitch a story, and then the editor says, I am not interested. You could do all the research, you could do all the background, due diligence and so on and so forth, book your interviews and everything, and the editor says, I am not interested in this story in this particular time. Your story is in the gutter. And there isn't an alternative platform for you to go and then tell that story. And so when we are talking about reclaiming the lens and then trying to change the narrative, I think that in Africa, we are not out of talent, because we are some of the best writers in the world, and I don't have to go through the list with you. We have talent, we have expertise, we have indigenous nuance and context. But what we don't have, and just to pitch into the points that gentleman from Kigali, is it? Yes, was making, that once you get to that point where you need the infrastructure, you need the distribution channel, and so on, and there isn't any distribution channel available to you, you circle back to ground zero. And until, as Africans, we have been able to come together, and this is a shining example with Al Jazeera and what the Qatari government has done with it. Of course, you can have your questions about the involvement of the Qatari government in the production and what have you of Al Jazeera. Of course, they maintain, and I think to a very large extent, a certain level of editorial independence. Where is our example? Between 1999, when Al Jazeera started, they started with a $25 million seed fund. In 2024, it did $1 billion. $1 billion. You want to divide the folds that it's grown in just a matter of under 30 years. It's giving you an indication of how much the Qatari government, for instance, has appreciated Al Jazeera as a source of soft power for it. And so we're just going to put more money in it and let it do the kind of things that it's doing, because it's given us a frontal, if you like, a front seat to the world affairs and so on. I heard, and just to end the point here, yesterday, the WTO boss mentioned that African countries should look at practicing what she called, polyandry. Deal with the West, deal with China, deal with EU, deal with America and everything. My question was then that, okay, so what's going to happen to us, because you are trying to please so many interests at the same time? What is your interest? What is yours? You speak to the Americans, you say, okay, yeah, you want this, fine. We can do this to this extent. You speak to the Europeans, we can do this. We speak to the Chinese, we can do this. What is yours? And I suppose that on the level of media, arts, and culture, the African continent needs to rethink what is the African narrative. What is the African identity? We grew up watching American movies and saying, the American dream. America is a land of the bold and free. You can achieve everything. We're asking to reclaim the narrative. What is that narrative? It's a rhetorical question. I want you to think about it. What is that narrative? Go on.
How's everybody doing? Cool.
That's a really good voice.
So I'm going to push back on that a bit. I do think we have an interesting opportunity in this modern age. I mean, it's not about who owns the lens. There are multiple lenses now. I mean, technology has been this grand equalizer. Yes, there's still people who own every social media, whether it's TikTok, etc. But I'm looking at it from the perspective of the individual, from the micro perspective, the individual creators, the individuals who are able to take advantage of technological tools to tell stories. The burst of music, African music, into the spotlight in the world did not happen because we were given access to the archaic lenses that were there, right? It's because through our own independent creative prowess in some small studios and bedrooms in Lagos, Nairobi, Joburg, etc., created these things that then took a hold of the internet and then took a hold of the people. So I think there's more agency that individuals have now because of technology, and we should not neglect that. Of course, all these big media platforms are still relevant, well, for now. But I do think it has changed radically. A lot of these people are taking even their sources from the internet. They'll come and then they'll ask you permission to use your tweets and all these things that have gone viral, all of these things. So I do think we have to, in reclaiming, we have to understand how we have a grand opportunity with how technology is moving. You know, my career is not even possible if there was no technology. Back in the day for musicians, you go, you make a demo, and then you go to a big producer or studio so that they can validate you by paying for you to put out a record. That doesn't happen anymore. A kid somewhere in Kumasi right now is creating something phenomenal and might have a viral moment and doesn't need any old infrastructure's permission or validation and can tell their story that way. So I think it is an opportunity for us to kind of focus on how to take advantage of the moment and how technology has become this equalizer, and there's the democratization of storytelling. And so maybe looking at that more or less than what we didn't have access to, or those old, what do you call it? Those old buildings. I'm sure some of those people who own those buildings came from here. Those old buildings and institutions that, as much as some are progressive, some aren't, are not necessarily at the forefront of how stories are being told anymore.
I just, and this is, you know, just to, I don't want to push back. I want to agree with you in a slightly different way, and in that attempt to try to push back. You have made a point that, of course, and in my earlier submission, I made the point that, look, we have come a long way. And for anybody to sit anywhere and say we are still where we are, say 25 or 30 years ago, that would be an absolute lie. Here lies my point of departure. There is so much opportunity on the African continent. And I refer you to the UNCTAD report on arts and creativity from 2024. It said that across the world, the creative industry and its exports from country to country, continent to continent, amounted to a total of $1.4 trillion US. $1.4 trillion US. You want to ask yourself, how much of that was from the African continent? I'm not going to shock you. I know it was about less than 3 billion. Less than 3 billion. And that's obviously less than 1% of the entire world creative services export. And so I appreciate your point on the democratization of, you know, access and all of that. But it's a bigger conversation of how do we get a larger chunk of the global creative industry. It is okay for Manifest to be reached out to by the CNN and so on for his tweet and so on. But how can, on a larger scale, the West African creative community, the East African creative community, the South African creative community, how can we tap into that ongoing $1.4 trillion US? I'm not quite, you know, satisfied with the 3 billion performance when we have ongoing 1.4 trillion US, and that's where my point is coming from.
I just want to jump in here real quick, because the next question kind of lends itself to what we're already speaking about. But how can governments and private players co-create enabling environments for, you know, culture, for narrative change, to be able to support, you know, creative industries? And just to share something really quick, during my research in Ghana, I was researching the film industry, and I think there was a lot of desire for creating appropriate infrastructure to host large productions, to host, you know, large-scale movies, films, music videos, and so on. So I know that even from a legislative point of view, that is a desire among the creatives. So I'm really curious to hear what maybe some of the solutions or things that you think would contribute, or how institutions across the African continent can, contribute?
I'll go quickly. I think for me, it's heavily an investment, infrastructure, and then also having institutions that tailor to each industry. So for instance, I think if you look at the West, you have fashion schools, music programs. The BFC is a really big supporter of new generation designers in the UK. And I think having that support that is one African-owned and funded is going to be key in really amplifying those stories. And for context, I'm the marketing and partnerships lead at Selfridges, and it's so interesting the amount of brands, African brands, that want to get into Selfridges, but they don't have the backing. And their biggest thing is, one, they can't meet stock requirements. From a marketing perspective, they don't have the right funding in order to make an amplified storytelling piece. And a lot of the time, they end up looking at global partners to get that funding, right? But then again, if you go to your Nikes, your Netflixes, etc., if it's not on their priority as an agenda, they're not going to support it. But then where is also our funding from the continent? So I think there's one where we need to look at how there's better funding within the continent. I do think global brands need to also look at how they are supporting Africa as a continent and the youth, because like I said, they're culturally relevant. There's so much there within film, music, fashion. So I definitely think there's a lot that can be done in terms of like having the right infrastructure, institutions, and the investment to help that grow.
So I'm just going to briefly touch upon the end of the last point to segue into this one, because I thought they were quite well interconnected. In my industry, by contrast to journalism and in animation and storytelling and music, I think I had a little bit of insight into this idea of participating in more of the value chain of African cultural production. I used to work at Sotheby's, which is depending on which day you ask, the largest auction house in the world for art and luxury. And I was in the African Modern and Contemporary Art department. So we directly dealt with the works by African artists from throughout the continent. And we had, 51% market share for 6 years running. So this was the de facto marketplace for African art, and it was run out of London. There is this real sense that artists make this work on the continent in their homes, and they send it abroad to actually tap into more robust, more liquid, more broad markets, right? But something interesting, a nuance within that point kind of emerged to me as my time there. The artists not only were sending the work to get more money, but they were actually sending it because there was a lack of institutions which recognized their prowess as artists. And so they looked at an international marketplace as something that was a notch on the belt, so to speak. And that goes in real contrast to artists who are positioned within the West, who fear the marketplace and always move towards these altruistic institutions like museums, which have no mandate whatsoever to participate in the sort of day-to-day commercial activities associated. So we found that, artists coming out of Accra, artists coming out of La Côte d'Ivoire, artists coming out of mainly West Africa, actually, were looking to the West to sort of affirm their skills, their chops as artists. So that goes to show, moving it onto the role of government, that goes to show that there is a space, there is a desire on the ground for cultural practitioners to have institutions which they can use to signal to the rest of the world and the indigenous populations that they have matured, that they have come of age, that they are of high quality. And just to sort of anchor this point in the national conversation, look, culture is a construction. Culture begins. And look, the only sense in which a top-down government initiative to develop infrastructure has worked is in the cultural realm. You ask anyone who has to build a dam, anyone that wants to build a bridge, anyone that wants to build a road, they tell you private sector is much better than the public sector. But in culture, the public sector reigns supreme, because there is a certain cachet and gravitas that you get with the association of the state that you cannot have by association with commercial enterprise. And so, when you look, if you walk the streets of Paris, right, and you go to the Louvre, and you see the beauty on that street, you think almost this kind of acquiesce naturally. No. There was a chief architect called Jean-Eugène Haussmann, who in the 1800s decided to widen the streets, kick all the poor people out of Paris, put lights at every interval, create the Louvre, create these grand institutions, and create the city. Now, there are 20 million visitors a year in the Louvre. They make hundreds of millions every year just from ticket revenue, and the same is the case across Europe. The Tate Modern has 5 million visitors a year. The British Museum has 6 million objects, or even more. They don't even know how many they have, and they have millions of visitors commensurate with that. And so the truth is, when you build these national institutions and you are able to select, you're able to anoint the leaders of the cultural of the leaders of culture in younger generations, such that they're able to participate shoulder to shoulder with their equivalents globally. And if you don't have that infrastructure on the ground in your continent, then they're at the whims of collectors and institutions globally. And so then you're having winners picked from the continent, but decided by people who are abroad. And that leads to all sorts of very interesting, very problematic things. In the African art market, what it led to was the formation of a bubble, for African, what do we call figurative African work, which showed black faces on canvas. And you had a lot of collectors who were feeling guilt because they didn't have works which were made by black people or showed black figures post George Floyd. And so they bought up works and they decided who they were going to buy. And those artists became successful because of European collectors and European institutions. And the moment money wasn't free anymore, and the moment that the sentiment changed, those people pulled back, and those artists now are left, confused about what they do next. And that would have never happened. That would have never happened if those collectors abroad had to go through a national museum. They had to go through a national art festival. They had to go through all of these institutions which tag these individuals as quality and signal to everyone that these people have the attention of the indigenous communities first. And then they can participate in global landscapes. So for me, I think the government role is essential.
Thank you so much for the mini history lesson as well. Yeah, this is really great stuff. Slightly shifting gears, but not all the way. There was an article that came out, I believe, the end of last year, from The Guardian, and it said Africa lost $2.9 billion in revenue due to its media perception. In global perception. And I know we've all seen the negative stereotypes and I don't want to get too much into that, but what do you think, or how can we be strategic about how we represent ourselves in all of our respective industries and changing the perceptions of African nations?
I'll go, by the way, that was a very good speech. I'll go by saying, I'll give an example of the success of Iwaju and what it did in that area of things. A lot of people usually talk about perception and they try to write books. You cannot control how somebody sees you unless they feel it. In other words, if I make you see me in a certain kind of way, doesn't matter how much you don't want to, you're gonna feel it. And that's one thing we realized with Iwaju. And one thing we noticed is authenticity tends to beat everything. In other words, a goal of trying to show Africa better than it is or worse than it is, both do equally the same amount of harm, which is a very weird thing. And the way I realized this is when Iwaju came out, one of the stories actually almost made me cry. That's how deep the story was a friend of mine had a friend, and the friend was like, oh, my daughter saw Iwaju, and every single time before Iwaju, I would tell them, hey, we're gonna go back to Africa. She would cry. She'd be like, the internet is bad, etc., etc. After watching Iwaju, she was like, hey, I want to go to Lagos, Nigeria. She said that by herself. And I was thinking about it. I was like, for something to have that level of impact. Now, keep in mind, Iwaju, kidnapping happens in Iwaju in Lagos. But the kid was like, oh, just based on how everything was there, she wanted to go there. She wanted to experience what Lagos was. And that's because we didn't try to show what we think Lagos should be. We try to keep it as authentic as possible. And there are some things you cannot capture when you're trying to narrate the story. There's the way I see the world that's different than the way you see the world. So if you see something authentic, you're going to interpret something different from it than I am. And that authenticity beats most of the things we try to do today. For example, if there's a diversity program, for example, and they're trying to just tick a box, like, okay, we're going to have this number of people in this story. If that's not how the thing naturally occurs in that area, I actually believe it does more harm than good. I think if you keep it authentic and you make stories, if you want to do a story which you have, for example, African women, go see where the stories of African women are happening and actually tell that story. It will feel authentic and people will fall in love with it. Versus trying to find a story where, let's say, like right now in Uganda, if you go to, there's a culture of some, like, be old men and they have one thing of beer down there, it's called Uganda Waraji, and they're drinking it with a straw and they talk to themselves. If you do that story and you put a woman in there, everybody in Uganda will be like, that's weird. So even if you've included a woman there, it's not going to have the effect you want. But if you find where the women are doing what women are doing there at that time, or what they're thinking about and what they want to do, and you include them in that story in the most authentic way, one, you give people what they want with authenticity. Nobody goes to a Chinese restaurant wanting to eat Italian pizza. So you want to give them exactly what they came for in the most authentic way they come for it. And that changes how people think about places and actually changes the narrative and directions of how the world is going to be. Now, Iwaju was viewed by, we don't know the exact number, but in terms of social media hits, 500 million social media hits in terms of communication and in engagement. How much has that shifted the African narrative just from that one little piece of media? I think that's the way to do it. Authentic African storytelling is going to beat everything. And as I say, stories shape our society, so let's shape our stories.
That was very good. I think for me, I find it quite interesting, especially when you look at travel and the perception. So for instance, I always like to say that you can go to Mexico, Portugal, and I'll be like, some of these streets look exactly like Lagos and Accra. And I'm just like, but if you look at the perception of those countries compared to Lagos or Accra, it's completely different. Similarly, so I love Mexico, but the other thing I always laugh about is Mexico has a very high crime rate, probably even higher than some African countries, and yet Tulum, Cabo, it is a destination for everyone, Mexico City. But then you have the most beautiful cities in Africa, Kigali, Accra, Nairobi, Tanzania as a country, so beautiful, and with waterfalls, lakes, so much abundance and everything that the world wants to look for. But yet for some reason, the media has portrayed it as famine and poverty and in such a negative light. So I think to that point on authenticity, I think we need to have more imagery, more context, more visuals that showcase Africa. I think there's been different platforms that have done it. For instance, I find it interesting how Netflix obviously did the Made in Africa content, right? So you've had Blood and Water, Savage Beauty, which are all films and shows that basically showcase Africa in different perspectives. To the point of whether they show them all in positive lights, it's debatable, but they're showing Africa, right? And destinations, and what I quite like is that they're showing Africa not in the lens of it is all just poverty and famine, you know? It's showing different destinations in Africa, different cities, and I think we just need more of that across multiple platforms. Like I said, power is numbers, do you understand? So I think for me, the more we can push that across a multitude of media, the better that people will receive it. Because at the end of the day, you need eyes, right? So I think TikTok and social media has been able to do that in terms of really people just authentically showcasing content. Do you know what I mean? I love to post when I'm on the beach, etc. But I think it's really all about making sure that we are all being ambassadors for Africa in our own capacity as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I totally agree with you. And just to build on that point, you talked about, your travel to Mexico and everything. It establishes the point that culture and art need to be experienced. The best version, or if you like, the best testaments that anybody could give will be born out of their prior experience of that product, that service, whichever it is. Now, across the world, in Africa, the average African is most likely not to travel out of their original home country. And so even if you lived in Ghana, chances that you never go to Togo, which is next door, are, say, 98%? And that, for me, is really incredible. And there's this, thinking of otherliness, that the global stage or the international stage is the West, or is Europe, or is America. Africa is home to 1.4 billion people. That, you're talking about eyeballs. Those are eyeballs. But on the continent, the country with the most penetration of travel per capita is Kenya, just about 26%. That's 2 to 3 out of 10 people in Kenya will, in their lifetime, travel out of the country. South Africa is around 16%, and you think Nigeria and a lot of them outside, but per capita is around 9%. That is potentially less than 1%, one person out of 10 people in Nigeria that will go out of their country in their lifetime. How do I go to Gaborone in Botswana and experience their culture? How do I get there and experience their art if my chances of ever traveling out of Accra are near, 0%? And so while we are talking about appreciation of art and our ability to go on and showcase to the West and everything, I want us to try and rethink our otherliness of ourselves. That when was the last time you talked about Africa to another person, and what did you say to them? I can tell you, it was a barrage of complaint of how frustrating it is to go through immigration when you get to Accra, or how police people stop you on the road to take bribes and so on and so forth. These are the things that we talk to people about ourselves. And it is because perhaps we are really limited in the extent of knowledge that we have of the African continent. Once we have been able to move from, and just to shock you, Sweden has a 99%, above 99% penetration in terms of travel, and most of them have gone to more than 10 countries. It is not a mistake or by accident. It's because they have free movement. I could do if you live in the UK, you could do a return to Paris for maybe £30 or £50. You can't do a return from Accra to Lagos for even £150. And that is a real issue that goes to the crux of our ability to experience what the continent has. So it's not just about artists coming to present their art and look for deals in the West and so on. It is also our ability to create systems and structures that facilitate our ability to go on and experience what is in Africa. Because I tell you what, Africa is beautiful. Yeah.
I just want to quickly touch on this. I really, really resonate with everything that you all have said, and I think it really boils down to, again, education, how we see ourselves. Because a lot of what we've consumed has also perpetuated the negative stereotypes and conceptions that we have of each other, right? And so even the theme of changing narratives, and some of our keynote speakers had mentioned African unity is so important in us having a collective voice. So I just kind of wanted to touch on how important it is to love ourselves. And I know, I'm not trying to do a mental health course right now, but it's important, how you walk in the world, how you see yourself, how you see your brother, how you see your sister. Those things are important, and this is where it all starts. How we talk about ourselves, how we create the movies, how we create our music. We have to be proud of ourselves. We are cool, we're amazing human beings. And sometimes we've been told that we're not, and that has, affected us. It's affected our psyche. It's affected everything. So it's so important that we really start to recognize and be intentional about the things that we create, from now on. And I'm so proud of the people all over the world that have already started doing that work. And I just want to give that little tidbit. So kind of moving on, how do you think, and in all of your industries, how do you think we can have film, media, music, marketing drive our culture, but commerce and also global influence? So really thinking about monetization, but also thinking about influence and perception on a global scale. So just, maybe any one of you would like to take that question. Maybe Manifest, since from a music perspective.
Yeah, I do think enough has been said about commerce and the economy of arts and culture, and I want to just depart from it because a lot of what has been mentioned here also is talking about some of the intrinsic value of art and culture, how we see ourselves, how we love ourselves. And echoing some of Elikem's sentiments, I do think we are undermining the transformative capability of art, and we cannot relegate it to what commerce dictates. If you leave it up to commerce, bleaching cream will be everywhere in Africa. If you leave it up to commerce, African artists will just sell their art elsewhere. If you leave it up to commerce and monetization, you are going to do what you think sells. There has to be something in there about transformation, posterity, and seeing beyond today. When you go to an African wedding, what music do you hear? Our music. It wasn't always the case. When I go to a club in Ghana, I don't really go to the club, but you hear our music. When I used to come here as a teenager, people did not identify as Ghanaian or Nigerian. They said they were British. Now they are Nigerian, British. And the music and the art has this capability. You cannot underestimate it and reduce it to commerce. So that's where I stand. Of course,
Yes.
I'm in the business of making money, so you have to pay up. But beyond that, in a sense of purpose, what drives people like myself and a lot of other creatives and other people who have taken the road less traveled is understanding this transformative capability of the arts in our culture, in who we are, who we see ourselves, and where we are going in the future. Our most important president understood this, so he made art a political priority. Kwame Nkrumah, no arguments here.
Yes. Yes.
And so he surrounded himself with the Ifua Sutherlands and other people to try and craft and shape what it looks like in our culture. I don't care about the commerce of it if we don't have a good quality of life for ourselves. I don't care. We don't have to sell a single music thing to anybody else, like you were saying. Like, if we are having a good time, our weddings, and we are doing intra-Africa tourism, and everything is going great, just the same way you can go to Paris and whatever, what do we care? The commerce and everything is important, but it cannot take precedence to the transformative capability and us being better people. I've finished.
Okay, so our time is almost up, but we would love to open this up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? Ooh, we got a couple here. Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph, and I'm from Ghana. This question is to everyone on this panel can address it. I would like to know the panel's thoughts on African propaganda, or how Africans use propaganda, and where or how we need to draw a balance between accurately representing our story versus not actually talking about our problems. Because it's true that there's a high incidence of poverty on the continent. It's true there's corruption. It's true there's a high disease burden. How do we draw the balance between talking about those issues accurately versus not getting to the point where it's now a propaganda where you say, it's all white beaches, blue skies, and paradise? Thank you.
I'll take that one. Are we doing a few? Or? Okay, two then. Awesome.
And then one over there.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Aaron. I'm from a social enterprise called the Community Revolution. And my question was around community media. So one of the things we do, we partner with different community-based organizations. So we have different countries, so Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania. So one of the key common themes we've seen is the problem in access to infrastructure and finance. So my question was, what can be done from that perspective? What can be done to empower and enable community media? And how important is it to the wider story about narrative? So I can give you an example. So, for example, one of our partners in Tanzania, for World Radio Day, we interviewed the founder. And one of the things they do is they train women in journalism. They have a community radio station. They publish local news, local media. However, because of energy, they can't always broadcast and have a limited range in their reach. So from the perspective for all you guys on the panel, what can be done in that situation for small organizations to empower people to tell their stories? Or what is needed in terms of bridging that gap in finance?
Okay, so we'll answer the first two questions and then we'll take one more.
All right, I'll tackle the propaganda one. I would say my answer comes back to the authenticity bit of things again. I want you to think of it like this. So authenticity and shaping the perspective of how the story is told. So all of us have probably watched Gangs of London or Top Boy, and those are showing poverty-ridden, crime-ridden places in London. You've watched, you've listened to hip-hop, rap music from America back in the beginning, like when you're starting off. And that's showing that. The issue is not showing it. The issue is showing the full reality of it. So if you just show somebody suffering with no context around it. So for example, you catch me, I'm an artist, right? Let's say you catch me one day, a deal has gone bad and I'm looking depressed. And you don't have any context around that. You could be like, we need to help this guy. You'll feel sad for me. But then you go around this and hear what I'm sad about is, oh, my flight got delayed, but it's a business class flight going from here to there. You'll be like, why is this guy complaining? So if you show the full context of what's happening there, so even in the most poverty-ridden places of Africa, there is a story you can tell where that boy who you saw, let's say was flying on their eye or something like that. There is a way that boy went through a day, and you can catch glimpses of it in other documentaries. Let's say when somebody is visiting the place, and you see the locals coming together, and they look happy. But they never look happy when they're asking for help, but they look happy. So if you capture the fullness of what that story is, there's something human beings always relate to. So we don't look at negative things in bubbles. We have to fill them in. So if the story we are being presented doesn't fill in what that context is, we fill it in and always fill it in the most negative way possible. So if there's somebody shows you a sad story with a sad person, you're going to fill it in the saddest way you can think about it. But if they show you the full story, the authentic story of what's happening there, you could think of the worst scenario. I'm sure you've watched a movie about the worst case scenario, and you saw somebody in that film and you're like, that guy is living a good life in that scenario. You've watched like an apocalypse, and somebody's living a good life in it, and we just don't believe that's going to be today. So authentically show what is happening, and I promise you people will get the correct context from it. Now, if you just cut it up and try to edit it yourself, you're only going to edit it from your perspective, and other people seeing it, they will see things you missed to see.
Right, so this is on the question of funding community engagement. I'm particularly passionate about community media projects because I train at the University of Ghana at a community radio station called Radio Universe. And I studied politics and philosophy in the university. It's got nothing to do with my journalism. And without Radio Universe, I'm not sure I'm here talking to people at the Oxford Africa Conference. So community engagement, really important. But how do you do it sustainably? In Ghana currently, the new government, as part of their campaign promises in a run-up to the 2024 elections, said that they were going to pump over, I think, about 10 billion US dollars with a project they called the Big Push. And in that Big Push, they were going to fund small enterprises, SMEs, I'm talking about creatives and others doing community mobilization in arts, in finance, in tech, and so on and so forth. They have added another layer they call the Black Star Experience, which is a build-up to a 2019 initiative launched by the erstwhile government called the Year of Return on the occasion of the 400th year anniversary of the beginning of slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, by that I mean. And so now there's a particular theater director in Ghana who's come up with an amazing play called Ghana Must Go, and he's received funding through these vehicles, the Black Star Experience and the Big Push, to go on tour with the projects that he's done. So he is screening the stage play in different countries with support from the government. I think that we need to get to a point where governments, if you like, investment groups and so on, begin to appreciate that it is not always the massive, and just to borrow the point that Manifest made earlier about commercializing everything and commodifying everything. They don't pay, sometimes, community engagements, they don't pay immediately. I graduated from the University of Ghana a long time ago, but today we're reaping the dividends. I suppose myself and yourself dialoguing at this conference are reaping the benefits of my undergoing training at that community radio station at the University of Ghana. So we shouldn't look at it as what is the immediate dividend that we're going to get out of supporting such a community project, but what is the bigger picture of how this is going to translate into creating educated publics, creating people who are skilled with the knowledge of whichever field that this community engagement is, participating in. And that, I think, is at the heart of whether or not we're going to decide to support community engagement. But obviously, I'm all for supporting community engagement. Yeah.
All right, one last question.
Nana.
Hello, thank you so much for such an amazing panel. I think this topic was very much needed in the context of Oxford. My question is for everyone here, and that is around the diaspora and how the African narrative, or rather racialized black people across the world who identify with Africa, either through generations or the enslavement, and so forth. How then are you guys thinking of integrating their redefinitions of Africa? I hope that made sense.
Do you want to take it? Okay, go.
I think with diaspora, for me, African countries need to do a lot to connect more with the audience, right? So I don't know if anyone came when Ghana did the Year of Return. I think that was a really great example where it was all about connecting back home. It was really about amplifying the Ghanaian story and the Ghanaian diaspora as well, and really getting to know what it means to be a Ghanaian, right? Similarly, I think from a diaspora perspective, you need to make sure that we're all telling stories and being ambassadors of Africa in different ways and capacities. And I think I mentioned earlier, if we are, I guess I would call myself a diaspora, but essentially, it's where we are also positioning ourselves within bigger platforms, right? So if I'm not at home, what am I doing in my own country to really amplify myself as an African, right? And also making sure that I am consciously going back home to learn more and educate myself more so that I can take that narrative back to what I'm doing, right? So again, I went to school in Ghana, Nigeria, so I have that context, right? But if I didn't, if I am in a global space and I'm working with global companies, I need to also do the work to make sure I'm going back home, doing the learning, engaging, and taking that back if that's the choice that I'm making, right? But I also think African countries have a duty to make sure they are connecting and making it as enticing as possible for people who don't feel connected, right? And I think a lot of different brands have actually played into this. So I don't know if there are any basketball fans here, but essentially, WhatsApp did a film with Giannis, the NBA player, and it was all about homecoming, and it was all about a diaspora story, right? They called him the Greek freak, and he made him a whole story and narrative about how being Greek is his identity, and that's what people know him for, but actually, he's a Nigerian at heart, do you get what I mean? So essentially, that was a really strong way in which there was a way that WhatsApp, for instance, used that as a way to really culturally engage, but also, I guess, Giannis himself made that effort to really go and find out what it means to be a Nigerian and his storytelling as well. So I think from a branding perspective, there's a two-way in that, like, diasporans need to do the work to engage as much as possible. I think it's very easy to sit back and feel like, to the point that was made earlier, I'm British, I'm American, do you get what I mean? But similarly, African countries have a duty to make sure they're also pushing and engaging diasporans as much as possible.
To follow on from that, we mentioned briefly the Africa No Filter report about the billions that Africa loses by virtue of the narratives told about the sort of Africa's inability to repay its debts, for instance. And the diaspora have a critical role in changing this narrative. They're part and parcel with Africans. For me, I see diasporans as ambassadors for Africa who happen to be in the West. And so they are often the first people in the West to to consume the content that comes out of Africa, to consume the cultural production. I mean, I remember sitting in my Africa Studies course at MSc and learning about Fuse ODG doing his song Azonto. And the first line is, I just came back from Ghana, and then he just does his whole, and he shows the dance. But basically, I remember going to school here, 10 minutes away from Gatwick, and seeing that on the TV and no one else in my common room in school understanding what was going on, and me being sort of flabbergasted that a Ghanaian man is on TV talking about how he's kind of going between Accra and London. And I stopped everyone in the common room to listen and look at this, you know? And so, and that's the kind of role that the diaspora has to play, being that first port of contact who we can prime to say, look, we are changing the definition of what it means to be African. And they then go on and change it in the sort of, you know, the proverbial seat of power in the West. So we actually need to remain in lockstep rather than sort of coming to these decisions of redefinitions of Africa independently and trying to integrate them, but actually doing them together.
All right, y'all. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but the conversation does not end here. Thank you all so much. My distinguished panelists, thank you so much for such an engaging conversation. I am truly grateful to each and every one of you. And thank you, audience, for everything. Yeah, so let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think they need a bigger hand of applause than that. This has been an incredible, incredible panel.
Amazing, amazing,
yeah.
Richly nuanced. I loved it. I loved it.
Just incredible. I think my biggest takeaway